This movie starts with Scylla having a dream. In it, she runs frantically to a house, imagining the walkway full of people partying. At intervals, the people disappear and reappear. She runs to the door and bangs on it, and while at the door, she repeatedly calls out to Janet, who is seen chatting and dining with guests. Janet doesn't notice her as she's overwhelmed with entertaining her guests. She wakes up from the dream and stands up. Her room has a lone bed in the middle with many artworks and furniture covered. The house hasn't had an occupant in years. She sits and takes a position that seems as though she's reminiscing on the dream she just had. The room is just a part of the big house. In the morning, she comes out smartly dressed. The walls of the house have weeds all over them. The compound seems to have been deserted for quite some time. Its large expanse of land is covered with both fresh and withering trees that have their branches and leaves scattered on the ground. She picks up a sledgehammer and begins demolishing a little pile of brick, as she seeks to put the compound in shape. As she goes on, Ford, a neighbor, walks into her compound. He tells her she has no right to walk into a private property and start bringing things down. Within seconds, Ford realizes she's the granddaughter to Janet, the owner of the property. Ford, making her know he remembers her, mentions a character she played as a child as her name. Scylla quickly corrects her and differentiates the character from her actual name. Scylla continues bringing down bricks while Ford admires her growth. He goes into rain praises on Janet. He can't hide his admiration as he mentions Janet's awards and achievements. Scylla is proud of Janet's achievement, but reckons she never met her as Janet passed away before she was born. Ford is interested in meeting Scylla and introduces himself first. Scylla wonders why his parents named him after a car, so he replies he was born in the back of a Ford truck. Realizing the need to allow Scylla to continue her work, he decides to leave but tells her he'd be willing to assist if she needs anything. As he leaves, Scylla thanks him. Much later, she drives into the compound with the tree at the back of the truck and notices a van parked at the side of the compound. The car pulls out as soon as she arrives. She's eager to make the place look great again and she gets onto it. She plants the tree at the two sides of the entrance. It's late in the night, and she retires to her bed and has a dream. She wanders around the house full of guests who are drinking and chatting in twos and clusters. Artworks and paintings of Janet decorate the walls of the house, and she finds her way to Janet, who seems tipsy. She laughs cheerfully in the presence of her guests and calls out to Janet, who is excited to see her. Janet asks for her pills, stating she needs them to sleep. Scylla suddenly finds a bottle of pills in her hands and hands it over to Janet. Janet takes the pill and asks the whereabouts of her son, Johnny, but Scylla tells her Johnny is no more. This upsets her as she falls on the couch in disbelief. There's a bang at the door and Janet frantically starts taking more pills, remarking she has to hurry. Scylla tries to stop her but to no avail. She wakes up from the dream to hear the noise of a moving vehicle. In the morning, she comes outside the house and realizes the tree she planted the previous day has been cut down. She goes over to inspect it when a truck pulls over just in front of her. Brian steps out of the car, and Scylla recognizes him and they exchange pleasantries. She complains of the destroyed tree and Brian helps her plan it again. Scylla takes Brian and a handyman inside the house. She shows them places she'd want maintenance to be carried on. She takes Brian to a room she'd love to use as an office space. The room is full of boxes containing Janet's stuff. She goes through some of them and finds magazines with Janet's pictures as covers. Much later, Scylla walks her friend, Shauna, outside. She sees the van parked again just opposite the compound, so she asks Shauna who she thinks drives the van. Shauna says it's Carl Hennessy. Scylla runs towards the van and inquires from him who might have cut down her tree, but Carl rages and spits on her. This prompts her to fall on the ground and Carl speeds away. Shauna runs over to Scylla and helps her up. She's inside the barn, going through Janet's stuff, when she finds many recordings of Janet. She picks up a box of pictures and brings out a picture of her grandmother, her mom and Johnny. She then stumbles upon a handwritten love letter addressed to a certain Trudy. She finishes reading the letter with a smile on her face when Ford calls out to her. Ford enters with a bottle of wine in his hands, and Scylla suggests the wine is like a housewarming present, but he objects. In his view, the wine is an advanced payment for a service. Ford is a graphic novelist. He reveals he's seeking a new character for a new series he's working on and he'd be needing her. He brings out a book that has drawings of different characters in it. He explains a certain character to Scylla, who opines the character is boring. She says this while she moves a lampstand towards the house. Ford follows her and continues his explanation, pressing Scylla further on needing her help. He only wants to see Scylla work while he takes pictures of her for his project. Brian comes in, shakes hands with Ford, and Scylla wonders why everyone around seemed to know themselves. Brian mentions he and Ford were high school classmates. Brian also mentioned that their parents always visited the house for interesting parties. Ford and Scylla exchange weird stares. Scylla uses a sledgehammer to demolish a little pile of bricks while Ford takes pictures of her. He suggests different poses for her, and Scylla asks Ford to help her, but he doesn't, stating he's better off behind the camera. Later that day, Scylla goes over to Ford's house. She's at the door with the bottle of wine Ford had earlier given her. Ford welcomes her in and she sees he has paintings all over his wall with the word prodigal inscripted on all of them. While Ford prepares something for Scylla, she reveals her mom was an actress and hated the place. Her mom couldn't come to terms with selling the place, hence Scylla's decision to buy it. She reveals her mom's likeness for the farm and mentions her dislike for Hollywood. He hands over a glass of wine to her and they get comfortable in the dining room. Scylla says her mom is keen on raising a family of actors, and this is the reason her mom pushed her into it. She recalls that being a child star made her close to her fellow actors at that time. Putting on a sorry face, she reckons she just wanted a home. Ford looks at her weirdly and she questions it. He feels like she's more beautiful than Janet and admits that his last statement is him hitting on her. Scylla has made a lot of mistakes in the past concerning her relationships, and she gives an example. If she were to sleep over in Ford's place, she admits she'd not sleep in the guest room but with him. She quickly switches the topic and they focus on their meal. Ford walks her to the door with Scylla thanking him for the dinner. He asks to walk Scylla home, but Scylla doesn't think it's necessary as she lives nearby. Immediately, there's someone riding a bike down the street to Scylla's house. Scylla mentions it's Steve and runs happily towards him. She jumps on Steve with excitement, after which they hold hands and walk inside. Meanwhile, Ford watches them using binoculars. It's nighttime, with Scylla and Steve sitting on the floor and making corrections on the building plan. There's a knock on the door and Scylla goes to get it. It's Ford, and he says he's just checking if she got home safely from his place. Steve wants to know who's at the door when Ford enters, so Scylla makes an introduction and mentions she was married to Steve for 5 minutes. Steve corrects the phrase and states it was 5 months. Scylla goes on to say Steve taught her everything she knows about house flipping. Steve expresses pride and mentions he also taught her other things. Scylla mentions Ford's full name and this intrigues Steve. He is excited realizing he's standing in front of the Ford Sawyer. He mentions Ford as the creator of the Prodigal series, which he is a big fan of. In excitement, Steve takes off his shirt and shows Ford a tattoo of one of Ford's designs on his back. Scylla is just a bit impressed but doesn't even show it. Ford is in his house working, when he decides to pick up his binoculars and look at Scylla's house. Over at Scylla's, Steve lays on the bed and Scylla comes to join him. She tells Steve he can stay for as long as he wants, but he'd need to get a bed of his own. She goes ahead and shares the bed with Steve. He pokes fun and makes the spooning position with her, but she rejects him, so he faces the other side of the bed. Not too long, there's a creaking sound and this gives Scylla reasons for concerns. Steve tries to make light of the situation, but she stands up and goes over to the window. She mentions she can't take things for granted as someone already destroyed the tree she planted earlier. She eventually goes back to sleep. Little does she know that someone dressed in black, carrying a flashlight light, is trespassing. It's morning, and Ford goes over to Scylla's house with the complete series of the Prodigal book. He meets Steve, who is excited to see him. Ford hands over the series to Steve as a gift and immediately asks Steve why him and Scylla split. Steve says they realized they were better as friends than as partners, hence the split. He mentions his sisterly love for Scylla. Ford thanks Steve and offers him the opportunity to sleep in his place instead of sleeping in the barn. Steve argues he didn't sleep in the barn, and this confuses Ford, who saw flashlights in the barn and immediately thought it was Steve. Steve asks about the time he saw the light and Ford mentions it. Steve and Ford go into the barn and notice the place was ransacked. Scylla comes in and is saddened by the mess made there, while Ford injures his hand trying to climb a ladder. They are outside the barn, where Scylla helps Ford remove the splinter in his hand. He reckons his inability to sleep at night knowing Scylla shared a bed with Steve. Scylla smiles but doesn't say anything about it. Scylla and Steve are outside the barn alone, and they put a padlock on the barn's door. She invites Steve for dinner later, but Steve is having a date with Shauna later that day. Scylla's excited for them. She's in her room and continues to go through Janet's letters. She notices where Janet mentions she was pregnant and seeks to know what happened to Janet, when she falls into a trance. She's seen with Janet in a large costume room. Scylla mentions her dislike for feeling alone and being the center of everyone's attention, while Janet says she's always happy anytime she's on set. This confuses Scylla, who remarks she and wonders how it correlates. She asks Janet if she was really pregnant and who the father was. As she asks the question, Janet dances away and gives no reply. Steve comes back from his date with Shauna later that night and parks his bike in the barn, when he's knocked out by an unknown person. It's morning, with Shauna and Brian entering Scylla's house. They ask the whereabouts of Steve, but she's surprised at the question as she thinks Steve spent the night at Shauna's. They go searching for him and sees the barn's padlock is broken. They go in and find Steve on the ground, unconscious, so they rush him to the hospital as soon as possible. At the hospital, Scylla is worried about the incident and wonders who'd have done that. Ford suggests it might just be a random scavenger and a case of wrong timing. Kathy, Brian's mom, comes and assures them that Steve is in good hands, and doctors are already operating on him. Kathy goes back inside while Brian goes back to the house. While Ford tries to cheer Scylla up, Detective Wilson comes in looking for Scylla. He asks to speak to her alone and Ford excuses them. He asks Scylla about her relationship with Steve and she replies they were married. He asks if there's a chance Steve was jealous of Ford and she denies this. She mentions Steve idolizes Ford. She advises that Detective Wilson looks for Carl. She mentions the incident that happened earlier where he spat at her and also her plant being cut down. Ford comes in and remarks that Carl might just have a motive and be involved in the happenings. Carl blames Janet for the incident that claimed Johnny's life, and Scylla remembers her uncle, Johnny, perished in a car accident. Ford tells them Carl's son was in the car while a drunk Johnny drove. Detective Wilson promises to go talk to Carl. He advises Scylla to either get an alarm system or get a dog, and she agrees she'd get an alarm system. Ford wants Scylla to sleep over at his place for security reasons, but she disagrees and resolves to sleep in her place. Ford then decides to sleep over at Scylla's but quickly states he'll be sleeping on a separate bed. It's night and they are home. Ford positions his bed close to Scylla's own, at her request. He tries to be a gentleman and turns his back while Scylla changes into something she'd be comfortable to sleep in. He too takes off his trousers and reveals his boxers with the prodigal inscripted on it. They lay on their joint beds, and Scylla reveals her joy having Ford around, with Ford feeling the same way. She falls asleep and has a dream. She moves around the compound with Janet and asks her grandmother what she's searching for. Janet replies she's searching for Trudy. Scylla wonders why Janet is searching for Trudy when Janet, is Trudy. She laughs, concurs, and takes Scylla to a grave where Scylla asks who she slayed on a certain night. Janet laughs and mentions she's pregnant. Shortly, Scylla falls into the grave, but it ends up as a deep dark hole without an ending, and she wakes up from the dream. It's morning and she's at Ford's house. She gives Ford some of Janet's stuff and letters to keep for her as the house isn't safe anymore. Ford goes through the letters and Scylla mentions Trudy was Janet's real name. She mentions incidents that happened from Johnny and Janet's passing, and reads out a letter someone wrote to Janet warning her not to threaten him again, else she'd pay for it. The letter insinuates Janet never stopped threatening Johnny's wife. She mentions Janet was carrying a baby and wonders why she knowing she has a baby in her. Still on that thought, she imagines the probability of Janet's passing not being but Ford thinks it was probably an overdose or an accident. Ford picks up the letters and suggests they hand it to Wilson, but Scylla disagrees, citing that the letters are from Janet's heart and very personal. She wishes to hide Janet's personal life from the press and fans so as to avoid backlash from people. She would prefer it's a secret kept between themselves and leans forward to get her face close to Ford's. Immediately, he suggests they go get ice cream, and Scylla thinks Ford is confused. They go out for the ice cream. Random people keep staring at her and make remarks about her being Janet's granddaughter. She isn't very comfortable with that and asks Ford if she looks like Janet. Ford mentions he doesn't know Janet as she perished a long time ago. He states some qualities he finds in her and they both laugh and continue walking back home. At home, the renovation is taking place. Scylla inquires from a worker what he thinks Janet would like with regards to the chandelier. The workman remembers Janet's likeness for a well-lighted place. She asks the workman if he heard stuff about Janet's love life. He replies that a lot of people said a lot of things, but that's as much as he knows because he didn't live close to her. Later in the day, Ford comes in and Scylla is showering. He admires the new shape the bathroom has taken and tells Scylla she doesn't have to shower in his place anymore. Scylla agrees but states she can still do that, but only if Ford asks nicely. He invites Scylla to dinner, but she states her preparation for a test she has. In the evening, Scylla is seen in Ford's apartment having dinner. Scylla wonders why Ford goes all out for her, but he thinks it doesn't matter. Scylla remembers Ford says things to her that no one has ever said to her and points out the time he said he wouldn't leave her alone. It's the next morning. Scylla is buying stuff in town and meets Carl. She accosts him and warns him to stay off her while Carl enters his van and drives away. She goes to the hospital and meets with Kathy and Tom, Kathy's husband. Kathy tells her Steve is doing fine and Tom introduces himself. Scylla wishes to talk to Tom about real estate as Tom is a guru in that field. She invites both of them over and they go their different ways. She's seen in Steve's ward. He is unconscious, but Scylla shares the feelings she has for Ford to him. While doing that, Steve responds and she's excited. She's home and listens to her voicemails. Shortly after, she puts on the light and notices the house is a mess as it has been vandalized. She's scared to bits. The police come and make their report. Scylla strongly opines Carl has something to do with Janet's passing and it wasn't termination. Scylla takes Wilson inside and shows him Janet's letters. Wilson states that Scylla's assertion suggests Janet and Carl dated. Scylla thinks there's a probability Carl murdered Janet and made it look like self-ending when she found out she was pregnant. Wilson promises to talk to Carl again. Scylla and Ford are on their beds and she blurts out that she might be making a mistake staying in the house. Ford advises her on the need to stay. She asks Ford to hold her for a little while, and Ford does, kissing her on the cheek. She asks why Ford isn't in a relationship and Ford mentions he's saving himself for her. The next morning, she goes up to Carl's apartment and meets Carl's wife. She has an argument with the wife and leaves, driving back. Carl chases her with his van and hits her. Then he parks in front of Scylla and makes Scylla stop her car abruptly. They get into a scuffle till Scylla hits him between his thighs, which brings him down. The police comes and take Carl away. Ford takes Scylla inside and shows her his new project. He shows her drawings of a character inspired by Scylla's persona and activities. She mentions she doesn't have control of who watches her and who takes pictures of her, but has the sole discretion of who sees her tattoo. She proceeds to show him her tattoo. Ford offers to change the character's face from hers if she isn't okay with it, but Scylla is fine with being an inspiration. She thinks the drawing isn't a perfect description of her, so Ford asks her to take a position while he makes a drawing of her. When it's ready, Scylla goes over to see it, and she loves what she sees. She caresses Ford, kisses him on the neck, and holds him close. They kiss, take off their clothes, and begin making love. Now laying on the bed, they hear a noise from Scylla's house and rush over to find Scylla's truck already vandalized. Ford holds her close and encourages her. It's morning and Scylla is outside putting herself in Janet's shoes and imagining how Janet enjoyed the scenery. Detective Wilson drives in and gives Scylla, who's with Ford, a report from the incident the previous night. He promises to go pay Carl's wife a visit. It's her test day, and she goes over to get that done. Now back home, she and Ford are having a couple's moment as they kiss for a few seconds. She brings out Janet's autopsy report she's successfully taken from the records office. The autopsy states she lost her life due to drug and alcohol intoxication. The pregnancy Janet talked about in her letter disturbs Scylla, and she decides to find out if she really was pregnant. She finds the doctor who certified the autopsy and gives him a copy. She asks the doctor to explain why he left the pregnancy details from the autopsy. The doctor claims he was made to avoid that detail and says he received a call from someone to omit it, so he obliged. The doctor confirms he didn't see anything to suggest Janet didn't unalive. Away from the doctor and with Ford by Scylla's side, Scylla calls her mom to confirm who Janet's publicist was. Her mom mentions George as the publicist. She opines that the publicist made the call to the doctor to omit the pregnancy in the report. She and Ford go over to Carl's wife and ask if she was the one who called the doctor after Janet perished. There's no tangible response from Carl's wife and they leave. They are in a different location. Ford goes over to drop something off and leaves Scylla in the car. Tom sees Scylla, meets her and decides to give Scylla a tip on real estate. Scylla comes home with Kathy, and the house reminds Kathy of the parties held back then. She recalls the last party Janet had in the house and gives a detailed explanation of how it went. She remembers the party preceded Johnny's passing and sobs a bit. Scylla asks Kathy if she knew about Janet's affair with anyone in the area, but Kathy replies she has no idea about that. Kathy thinks Scylla looks like Janet, and she's sure Janet would be very happy with the lady Scylla has grown to become. She whips out a picture of Janet smiling with a man. Kathy tells her the man's name is Drew, Brian's grandfather, who perished 20 years ago. The chit-chat remains friendly between the two ladies. That same day, Scylla goes over to Ford and tells him she's depressed as she met another sticky end. Ford seeks to make her feel better and hands her a copy of his new book. Scylla loves the design and appreciates Ford's talent while Ford praises Scylla's efforts. He kneels down and proposes a relationship, but Scylla feels a bit awkward about it. Ford sells himself and gives reasons why she'd be comfortable with him, but she objects calmly. Ford insists by bringing out a ring and asking her to marry her, but she tells Ford she isn't good with marriages. She tries to make Ford see reasons why they can't marry at the moment, but Ford persists until Scylla picks up the ring and wears it. They hug and kiss. They move a mattress into the house and opt to throw it on the floor, lay on it, play around, and end the night being intimate. Later that night while Ford sleeps, Scylla, who is awake, hears a creaking noise and she goes to check it out. She finds a doll fan and calls out to Ford. The doll conveys a message for her to leave or perish. In the morning, police are at the compound to take their report. Detective Wilson mentions the person wreaking the havoc has access to the house and advises Scylla to leave. Ford suggests she moves to his place. They are shown sleeping while Scylla dreams. Janet and Scylla are together and Janet mentions she believes in love. Scylla disagrees and tells her love never made her happy, according to stories she had heard about her. Janet hopes the pregnancy she's carrying is another boy, and Scylla wants to know who is responsible for the pregnancy. She doesn't say but mentions the person loved her. She goes further to imply that the person's wife was pregnant. Scylla seeks to know the name but Janet tells her to pay attention as she has the name already. It's morning, and Scylla is with Ford and brainstorming on how to find out the person's name. They bring out a yearbook and some pictures with Ford mentioning people he can remember. They do this all day and there's a car honking outside. Brian has come to pick Ford, who hesitates. Scylla pushes him to go meet Brian and he finally obliges her. He asks Scylla to lock the doors and not come out. Scylla is inside Ford's house and hears a creaking sound while Ford, Brian, and the boys are out. She goes to the door and sees Kathy. Kathy says she lost her ring the last time she was in Scylla's house. While walking Kathy to her house to get the ring, she mentions Ford's proposal to Kathy. They notice a sound from the bush nearby and walk inside quickly. Back at Brian's place, Ford notices a birthday letter written by Brian's dad to Brian on the wall. The handwriting looks exactly the same with the one in Janet's letters and he becomes uneasy. Back at Scylla's place, they find Kathy's ring and Kathy begs for wine and an aspirin. Scylla obliges and they share a bottle of wine while Kathy acts weird. At Brian's place, Tom meets Ford and Ford reveals to him he is sure he was Janet's lover. He mentions his love for Brian and Kathy, hence why he's telling him before going to the police. Tom is sure the letters are their only proof of the relationship and they are not even substantial evidence. Tom gives in and tells him he betrayed his wife for Janet. He mentions things just went sour and nothing was planned. Ford quizzes him about Steve's accident and he mentions he didn't mean to hit Steve that hard. Back at Scylla's house, Scylla and Kathy go through old pictures. Kathy says there isn't anything she wouldn't do to keep Tom. She says that while adjusting her clothes as if she's getting ready for something to take place. She takes off her coat and mentions she did things that'd make Tom never look at another woman again. This sends a message to Scylla, who now knows something is fishy. She tries to stand up but she becomes wobbly and falls. Turns out the wine was laced by Kathy, who now makes her finish the remainder of it. Back at Tom's house, Tom explains to Ford how he actually went to Janet, and they both argued on keeping the baby but confirms she was alive when he left Janet's house that day. He swears he couldn't have slayed Janet as she was carrying his child. They figure out Kathy might be the culprit here. Ford tells Tom to call the police while he goes over to meet Scylla as she might be in danger. Scylla is in a scuffle with Kathy but she's too weak to do anything. Kathy vents her frustration about Janet on Scylla. She rests Scylla on a cushion and brings out a pipe with a funnel-like ending. Ford is driving home and calls Scylla's phone, but Kathy picks up the phone then switches it off. Kathy cries that Janet tried to take Tom from her. Scylla, in her weak state, tells her she didn't have anything to do with it, but Kathy replies Scylla came back and shoved the whole situation back in her face. She brings out a doll and mentions the things she did just to try to make Scylla go away. She laces another glass of wine with a drink and mixes it. She goes into trance and sees Janet, who tells her to save herself. She gathers a little strength and hits Kathy in the head. She struggles with Kathy, who hits her till she is unconscious. Ford, who had arrived earlier in his place but doesn't meet Scylla there, rushes to Scylla's house and sees Kathy with the unconscious Scylla. Kathy picks up a gun but Ford overpowers her and takes the gun from her. Ford points the gun at Kathy and she begins crying and pleading innocence. Ford goes to Scylla to help her. Sirens can be heard in the background as the scene fades out. Away from the brawl, Scylla tiptoes to Ford and hugs him. He's busy, drawing on a paper. They chat a little and run inside the house like two lovers who have just found themselves.